All right. Happy Tuesday, everyone, and welcome to another Learning Tech Talks where we are exploring the landscape of learning technology amidst other things. Today, I'm joined by David Landreth, and he is from Augmentir, which we're going to be talking connected worker solutions, which you may be going, what's that? Well, I'm so glad you asked. I'm so glad you asked because we're going to answer that question today. And we're going to be talking really specifically about the industrial space, which I am really excited to talk more about because as large of the segment of the workforce as this is, it often gets little airtime. So we're going to spend some time talking about that and what that looks like. So David, thank you for joining me.
Hey, Christopher, thanks very much. I'm really excited to have this conversation.
Yeah, it's going to be a blast. So for those of you who are just getting started, just joining in, feel free to let me know where you are in the world right now. But David, for you, everybody recognize, right, this background, I've actually been asked, like, do you ever leave that space? I do occasionally. So I don't need to, everybody knows I'm in Wisconsin, but how about you? Because I got a chance to see your view. You turned the computer for a bit backstage. It's pretty there. So in the world you are in.
Yeah. So I am sitting outside of Boise, Idaho. We're up in the mountains a little bit. We've lived all over the place. I've worked out in the oil fields down in Houston, for Exxon, worked in factories back east in Boston. So have a lot of industrial background, but we wanted to get away and just be out in the open land for a while.
Well, and we were talking about this before I hit the live button, but your location it's my sweet spot too, where you're close enough to big things that you can do some of the bigger things, but you're also really close to not big things and rural. You've got the mountains. I'm very envious of that. It is not nearly as exciting in Wisconsin, but that's my jam. If Instacart and high speed can get to the house, but I can be out of my house and on a hike in a matter of minutes, I'm all for it.
Well, you're thinking ahead at a younger age. Clearly, I'm one of those old graybeards that's ready to spend their final days somewhere peaceful. But the idea of the graybeard fits really well into the conversation we're going to have. And the idea that supporting those industrial workers that are retiring out and how do we backfill that is kind of very similar to where I'm in life right now.
We are going to get into this generational piece because while I am not a fan of generational stereotypes, there's no denying that the diverse array of generations in the workforce right now it has to be something you consider. So we will get to that. But before we do, let's talk a little bit about your background and like what is the space that you've played in and how did it lead you to Augmentir?
Yeah. Thanks for that question. So clearly I've been around for a long time. I've done a lot of technology. I've been in the startup world for way over 30 years. Like to bring new ideas to market. And
did you always have the like entrepreneur thing? Is that always something that you knew you wanted to do?
I don't know if it was entrepreneur. I just didn't like people in mass, or I wanted to make a difference and be recognized.
This all ties to where you live. I get it now. This all ties to where you live. Okay, I got it.
Exactly. But yeah, I always kind of was. And my founding team is exactly the same way, right? We've all been in the industrial world. So anyone who's looked at technology, right? If you peel under the cover and you look at the people that created your software, their last company might have been something different, right? Like today you're creating a learning platform. Their last company was a dry cleaning software. Like we're not as creative. Like we've lived in the industrial.
I don't know if that kind of creativity always is good though. Sometimes it can be helpful, but sometimes it's like, maybe you should have just stuck with dry cleaning because I don't know that you necessarily made the jump. So I would actually advocate that may actually be a check in your positive camp for the fact that you actually grew up in the space that you're working in.
Yeah. I believe so as well. We've got almost 40 years in industrial software. Like Augmentir's founding team, we created this company, Wonderware, like over 35 years ago. It's now Aviva. It's one of the leading MESs. It was created to put a face on machines, right? Like basically it was like a robot. Think about having a computer monitor wired into your machine so you could see what was really going on in there. Pretty cutting edge ideas. Then we looked at some other systems. We created something that SAP bought from us that tied their factory floor to the back office. So back office
Okay.
under what was happening with machines. And then we
Okay.
created
So kind of connecting the dots between the floor to back
exactly,
office stuff.
always around the machine. And then we did one more, ThingWorks, this IoT platform that
I'm very familiar with ThingWorks. I did a
yeah.
fair amount with them when I was at GE.
Okay, yeah. And so sent that off to PTC, eventually sold that to
PTC
them.
bought it.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
So we were always thinking about the assets, about the machines in your facilities, but we recognized there was a problem. So as the leadership team was wrapping up their time at PTC after the acquisition, we started polling those 30 years of clients that we'd been talking to and saying, hey, what's next? Like, where are you struggling? And they said, it's obviously the people. Like, you've all thought about machines, but you're not bringing the worker into the digital thread. You're not supporting the life of an industrial worker. When learning helps our teams, they typically help us, the people sitting at a desk. But figure out,
for sure.
figure out how to support that worker. And so we set off to build out a platform that thought about performance support from the time you bring a candidate in the door until the day they retire from your company. How do you support their unique, varied needs? How do you drive engagement, which drives retention, right? And helps you fill in gaps in your organization.
Okay. So from this, and again, I think this is an important one because a lot of folks who are in our industry sometimes have the reverse problem. There's a heavy focus on the people, like people over here, and then works over here, and the dots aren't always connected. From what you're describing, where you went on the journey with Augmentir, was you said we have the inverse problem in the industrial space, which is we're really focused on the work and the machines and how all this stuff happens. And our tendency can be we sometimes forget to go, yeah, but all that is driven by people. And if we don't develop and focus and enable them, all this other stuff, that's great and all, but it's still not going to land. Is that fair?
That's exactly right. Right. Like the MO is to support a worker. You give them a little classroom time, and then they go off and they do what they do. In a factory, every second somebody's off the factory floor, you're risking productivity. So I never get them back in the classroom. And so I start creating this gap right away between the knowledge I need, the safety of my workers, and what I'm actually supporting them with. Right? We're huge fans of the concepts of Bob Mosher, 5 moments of need, right? Performance support. But even a lot of that methodology lives in the desk world. You see it a lot in pharma and life sciences. Supporting a worker at the time they're doing their job needs to be done exactly in the flow of work. So integrating, when you talk about connected worker, right, that whole, when that class of technology came about, it was pretty simply about digitizing work. Take my paper procedures and now put them on a tablet. But then taking that and integrating it with learning or using it as the learning so that somebody's actually capturing that knowledge and doing the task right at the point of a task, right? They're doing it right while they're at a machine. That gets much deeper ingrained than when you do it in a classroom where you might not even use it for a few months. So
let's unpack this one a little bit because I think it's actually worth diving into. And I'm notating where we are in the time so that we have chapters on this, because I think unpacking this industrial worker experience is an important piece because we talk about learner centricity, and are there elements of some of this stuff that is consistent? There absolutely is. And I think it's important that we go, yeah, we don't need to reinvent things from ground zero every single time. Yet at the same time, sometimes we vastly overgeneralize. And what you said there that actually stood out to me was I spent a lot of time in the regulatory pharma world and was very familiar with SOPs and this kind of paper-based performance support, like follow these instructions. But again, to your point, that is a different employee experience than an industrial worker, because that person still, to your point, is largely sitting behind a desk. What they're doing is largely computer driven versus my GE days where, well, if you're working on building an MRI machine, you're not at a desk. Like if you're repairing one of these things, you're not sitting at a desk going, okay, let me look at my screen and then let me go back and tippy type in my browser window. This is a completely different experience.
That's right. That's right. And if you take it even farther upstream, downstream, and I'm not sure which direction this goes.
Whatever stream, we got the fishing analogy going. We're going somewhere, fly fishing.
Yeah, there we are. That's always upstream. So if you think about the challenge for an industrial organization, they can't get enough people, but it's chicken and egg.
True.
They want enough people, but they have this really diverse set of skills that they're asking for. The reality is those people don't exist anymore, right? Like when we were kids, your dad, your granddad, your uncle, everyone worked in the factory. They learned it over the years. Pretty simple analogy. Like right now, my son couldn't change the oil in his car. Right? We don't grow up with the same aptitude to do simple industrial things. And so if I'm hiring, I need to open the aperture on the people that I'm going to look at. I need to hire more for potential. Who's got the desire and the interest?
Because what you're talking about is the pool is smaller than it was 30, 40 years ago, where it was like, well, you may not have worked in this industrial setting, but you're at least familiar with the environment. You kind of have that approach to thinking about things. Now it's like, well, that pool is much smaller.
That's right. And so if we're going to suggest to an organization and help support them increasing the pool of candidates, how do we immediately assess them on the shop floor? How do we support those 4 generations of workers coming in the door with different levels of knowledge? And that's where the idea that you need to personalize your approach to performance support really comes in. Right? Teach me the simple things I need to know in the classroom so I don't lose a hand when I'm down on the factory floor. But all of those other things I can be taught, and then having an AI backbone that assesses. I gave Christopher a program to follow. I gave David a program. Christopher's actually killing it. You're excelling. You're moving right on the path you should.
As expected. As expected.
Right? Yeah. Here's the next thing for you. And for David, it's not working. So we need to give him some additional support. We need to get something else in his hands. And then we can start looking at that learning data that we're pushing out to see, are there commonalities? Is the program not working for anyone? Is it working for certain cohorts? Are there demographics where they get that better? So how can we test the efficacy of the learning that we're pushing to the shop floor? So those are the things we focus on: aligning work and the skills, and then measuring the outcomes.
Okay. So let's talk about the skill development life cycle, I guess, in some ways with this, because what you just talked about in some ways highlights the complexity of what we're talking about here. Because, and again, I don't want to undersell that, oh, it's so much easier for knowledge workers, because it's like, well, no, that's got its own set of challenges and teeth and hair. But it's a different dynamic approach, because to your point, if you're bringing in a diverse group of folks into an industrial setting, one thing that is different is you may be dealing with life or death consequences to screwing this up. If you bring a knowledge worker in and you go, here, sit at this desk, and we don't really necessarily prepare you super well, chances are nobody's dying. But you bring somebody in who's not familiar with the manufacturing environment, and you go, here, just stand on the line and put this piece into that thing and then move this piece over. They could be dead at the end of the day, potentially, if they don't understand the environment they're working in. So I'm curious, talk a little bit about that skill development, what that trajectory looks like. Because I can see where there's not a whole lot of room to go, well, we didn't really get to that kind of stuff. Oh, Judy's dead. Shoot, I guess we got to hire somebody else.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And so what we see as just a very simplistic program to set the foundation before AI even starts assessing those workers. We've got a favorite client. They've got, like me, they've got a bunch of old graybeards in their facility, but they had to start hiring again. And they said, we don't really know where to start with the skills. So that we just brainstormed. The way that we got started was they brought the CFO down to the factory floor. CFO had never been on the factory floor before, had the CFO walk through the job, right? Go through the procedure. Every time the CFO got stuck, we added some extra helpers. We included some videos. We took some macro level learning content. from a provider, and we created a program. And this is now used for all new hires. And then you look for certain inflection points where they excel. They hit a threshold. We do calculations around worker proficiency. And when they hit a certain proficiency, they then get pushed that next piece of learning. Right. And we continue to assess. And that's how we drive it. Because we've talked about a lot of reasons there's a challenge, but it's also an issue that for most of our industrial clients, if you ask them, their supervisors on the shop floor are the youngest people there. Very often they've been put into roles like leaders. Yeah, but they don't know anything about the worker. They don't know true capabilities.
Is that a recent shift? I mean, has it always been that way, or how has that? Because I can see that could potentially be a dangerous dynamic when it comes to the skill development, is if the people who are overseeing it don't know it, they may completely miss some of this.
That's right. And I would say it's been the last 15 to 20 years. It's been coming for a while. For as long as people have talked about the gray tsunami or the great resignation, this has
I haven't heard the gray tsunami. Oh, that's a first. Okay.
Yeah. So it's been happening for quite a while. And then you're right. And so those supervisors don't necessarily know. And a lot of decisions are made subjectively and not objectively. There's no real measure. And that not only puts workers at risk, but it's a huge driver behind the churn that we're seeing within organizations. If you and I come in and start working tomorrow, and I look over and it looks like we're doing the same exact things, and the supervisor says, hey, you're both doing a good job, but you get a promotion and I don't, and there was no way to measure that, right? I don't belong. And we've got clients, think about like an Oscar Mayer factory where they've got 100% turnover in a year. People are constantly rolling in and out because they don't understand that they belong. They don't know how they get measured. They're not upskilled.
And I'm even so the example you just gave, where maybe you and I are on the floor and we're both doing things, and it's like, well, you know what, we're going to give Christopher a promotion and not David. I can see how that would only affect, but I can also see if David, you've been there 15 years doing this, and you are more efficient. You are like more attuned to the safety risks. You're more like, there are things that maybe that shop manager who just doesn't understand the work is kind of like, yeah, you're both doing it the same. And you're going, are you kidding me right now? Like, Christopher over here is screwing up left and right, and I'm cleaning up his mess. And you just promoted him. And I'm the one who's actually got the knowledge and I'm actually help. I can completely see where people would go, forget this nonsense. I'm not sticking around.
Yeah. That's a really good call out. And in fairness, right? Again, because the supervisor doesn't know, because there hasn't been a really good way to capture that tribal knowledge. Right? One of the challenges with any
it's a huge risk.
Yeah.
Now you leave the company with 23 years of experience doing this. My math is all over the place right now. But you get, right? You've got 2 decades plus of experience, and you go, forget it. If they're going to promote Christopher because he shows up and like whatever, I'm out. And now all that tribal knowledge is like right out the door. And now I get killed because I'm, not paying attention.
That's right. Yeah. And so that was another core tenet when we started Augmentir, was the ability to drive engagement and democratization of work, rather than somebody pushing down on you how you've got to learn, how you have to do work procedures. Being able to capture that knowledge to gamify in our platform. I've got one client who every other month, they give their workers a half hour to go and capture content that's going to go into their learning modules. And this Ernie's been working with this company 32 years, and he walks up to a machine and says, yeah, those vibration sensors are really nice, but when my fingers do this, that's when we got a problem, right?
Okay. And again, that's taken years of experience to know that you wouldn't get from an e-learning. Yeah. So I want to transition to this. Because like, how does this actually start to play out? Before I do though, I don't want to close the loop, because I am curious. So the assessing the skill piece, you talked about, I love the example. They brought the CFO down and they were kind of like, all right, like, here you go. Like, let's see how are you helping with that? Because I have to imagine, and I've been saying this about any sort of role, assessing that piece, skills, is so critical, period. Because if you don't, you have no baseline to operate off of. So how is Augmentir playing a role in helping kind of baseline that to go, all right, here's where the skills are? And if so, how?
So we do in some ways. I don't want to say that we can take credit for doing all of that, but
Okay.
just like to simply frame out our technology, we built a purposeful artificial intelligence layer that looks at two things. It looks at your workers and it looks at your work procedures. So as your workers
Okay.
start doing any given task, they can do it, say, 3 times. And our data will start looking at how do all of your workers
Got it.
basically against each other. We'll pull out
Yep.
anomalous data and give you a real sense
Okay.
at every task. Where is your worker strong? Where is their ability to make them better? And then that's where we
Got
push
it. No, and that makes sense because people are they're actually, because they're following these procedures, you're knowing that they're actually going through it. And then because everybody's doing it, you're actually able to start baselining. Okay, Christopher's doing it like this. David's actually doing it like this. One question that came in, and I want to make a clarification for folks, and then we're going to keep going here. LinkedIn user, you got to change your settings. I can't for some reason see who it is. So what's interesting about this is we're talking similar to, if you tuned in last week, we were talking about digital adoption platforms that overlay in systems. That's great if you're talking systems, right? But really, I think, David, what we're talking about is, but how do you do that kind of thing in the real world where you're not dealing with people sitting behind a desk whose workflows are in a computer? And that's exactly what we're getting at. An industrial worker, they're not sitting at a desk typing in these workflows, and their business processes aren't in a system. They're actually out on the shop floor doing this stuff. And what Augmentir is doing is similar to what a digital adoption platform does, but in real life, if I'm articulating that right.
That's exactly right. Yeah, I
Okay.
don't know that there's anything I can add to that.
Well, good. Perfect. All right. So that makes sense, right? In terms of the skill assessment, people are going through their workflows, their processes, and you're assessing, okay, well, how quickly are they doing it and where are they getting stuck and all of this, which is then aggregating the skill piece. Now, you talked about the personalization of that. And I think that's a really important piece because going back to what you shared with the CFO example, if you built a traditional training model and you
Yes.
treated everyone like the CFO, you would piss off a lot of people who went, I'm not someone who has never done this before. I do have that. So how do you actually help personalize that? Because as you said, with the diversity of the workforce, you've got people who are the CFO type who have zero experience. Then you probably got people who've been around the block, and a good chunk of this, they're like, yeah, I already know this. I just need to know the nuance.
Christopher, that's like the heart of the challenge here, I think, right? And there was a generation of connected worker platforms before us, and so many of them have failed because of what we call like the Oprah syndrome, right?
Okay.
You get a car. Well, I don't have a driver's license, and I drive in the UK. You can't treat us all the same and give us the
Right.
same tool.
It's offensive. Honestly, in many ways, it's offensive.
Absolutely. And if you create for the averages, you underserve the new employee and you overserve the employee who's been doing it a long time, and then nobody uses the application.
Right.
So that when we looked at building everything on top of an AI platform, it was so that we could assess and score proficiency of workers. And then based upon those proficiency scores, we can assign different work procedures and learnings that will automatically happen. So you may even be a level 2 tech, a very proficient tech who's been doing something for 15 years, but you've been out on paternity leave for 90 days. Our application will look at that recency calculation and say, well, Christopher's a pro. We're going to give him this helper set of procedures and this helper content as a learning.
So it's even nuancing down to that level of being able to see, like, when was the last time you even performed this task to go, yeah, you may be an expert, but you haven't done this in quite some time. So let's actually support you through that.
That's right. And again, you could make assumptions because Christopher has been doing this forever and he's on the forklift every day that he's super proficient, but you haven't been on the forklift for a little while. So we'll give you a helper. Or last night at midnight, your forklift certification expired. And because we integrate those learnings and the work procedure, you won't be able to do the work. It will let you know, to let your supervisor know.
Okay,
And
it'll
then,
actually say like, hey, you can't, even
yeah,
though you maybe have the skill, there's a gap that would actually prevent you from being able to do this task. We need to get that taken care of.
that's right. And then at the same time, push you a refresher course so that you can get recertified.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So this is, yeah, the connected worker piece. I like, again, the tag for it makes perfect sense because again, what you highlighted and I we talked about, because a lot of times we do shoot for the law of averages. All right, well, some people are over here and some people, let's do this. But I always say, like, it doesn't matter if you cast the widest net. If you cast it on the beach, you're not going to catch any fish. And I think a lot of times that's like what happens. It's like, all right, there we go. And it's like, well, yeah, but nobody's actually,
That's,
nobody's
yeah.
over there. So we completely missed it.
Yeah. You're exactly right. Right. And there's times when you've got the net sitting there. We've got 3 or 4 nets for 4 different versions of your worker, of your best worker, for how they learn, how they perform. And some of those procedures may not get used for quite a while because you've got nobody with that proficiency or competency. So as you go through fits and starts of hiring, and you need different levels of support and training, the platform thinks about that and looks and delivers just what's needed. Again, it will shut
Okay.
down the things you don't need to do.
So what immediately comes to mind is what we just talked about there in terms of the personalization. Because I think in many ways, what we're describing is the ideal of what many are trying to do for employees. I mean, we're trying to do this across the board, not just for industrial employees. We want to do this for everybody, where it's like, well, you're new to the company. Here's what you need because we know you're here in the journey. And based on this, we're providing you with this support and going through all of this. And here's a development opportunity tied to it. One of the complexities I often encounter on the knowledge worker and corporate side is there's often tremendous discombobulation around this stuff. It's sitting in 32 different systems. It's, in 18 different platforms. You're using 43 different workplace user experience tools. And so it becomes really hard. Like even certifications that people have, it's like, well, that's in this system, but that system doesn't talk to some of this. I'm actually really curious. How are you helping pull all that together? Is it, first of all, one, is it a little bit easier in the industrial, not to oversimplify, but is some of that more worked out? And two, how are you doing it?
Yeah, great questions. So I would say in the industrial world, it's not necessarily easier.
Okay.
Um, we had we have some unique capabilities that helped. First, when I
Okay.
talked about starting Augmentir and we pulled our client universe, they said there were 2 problems. I highlighted the people one, but the other was incorporating the individual into the digital thread because connected worker tools historically weren't good at integrating into other systems.
Yeah.
Our background as ThingWorks, ThingWorks as an IoT platform that brings systems together. We have the
That's what
same.
the whole thing was. It was like it brought all this stuff
Yeah.
together.
So that's what we focus on. We're not going to be
Okay.
your LMS unless you're a small company that doesn't have one and wants one.
Okay.
As soon as we started thinking about skills, inside of a day, we had built out an integration to all of your SCORM, XAPI, AICC layers, right? All of your protocols, so that we can leverage your existing systems.
Okay.
We can
So you
take.
started, if I'm hearing you, I'm going to let you keep
Yeah,
going on this, but
yeah.
to some degree, it sounds like integration was part of the plan from the beginning instead of an afterthought of, hey, we built this amazing thing. Oh, crap. Everybody has everything everywhere else. Now, what do we do about it?
That's right. That's right. And having that mindset is far easier than trying to figure it out after the fact, right? Like we knew about
Yeah, it
learning.
is.
Just this past week, we had a client who said, "Hey, can you integrate our SharePoint because we want a lot of our content to live there." We hadn't done
Okay.
one. We did one in a day. We brought it in. So now we've got data coming from there. We've got it coming from their Oracle LMS. We've got some coming in from the Cornerstone. So we brought all those
So you're not
systems.
necessarily trying to, Augmentir is not necessarily trying to become the panacea of, oh, we're the everything. Instead, you came into it and said, well, we know companies have, especially in the industrial space, they're using a lot of different things to manage this stuff. We've got to just be the thing that brings it together.
100%, right? We definitely don't want to take over things. When you think about learning content itself, you've got your macro and your micro level content. If somebody's
Yep.
using an Alchemy or a Valor, we bring that content down into our platform, right?
Okay.
Leverage what you've already made investments in. You can create the floor level learning right in our platform. You can curate it, you can edit it and do those things for something unique to your machine. But everywhere else that there's a system of record, we don't want to get in the way of HR, any of the learning, any of the OD part of the organization where they need that data to make other important decisions around their workforce. We simply want to own the pieces that impact the floor, that impact your worker getting onboarded efficiently, keeping them safe, making them belong in the organization and hang around.
Which, and I'm going to run a use case by you to make sure you can check my thinking on this. But to this is where sometimes I've seen, especially having worked in the industrial manufacturing space and helping in some orgs that are doing that, this is where a lot of times you do see these silos because maybe corporate has said, well, we have this tool, and the industrial teams have gone, I mean, that's fine, but our people aren't sitting at a desk. We need a tool that's, doing work instructions on a tablet instead, not a traditional SCORM e-learning package. Even though we might need some of those things for some of the things that we're doing, we recognize that. So, and then as a result, you create a terrible end user experience because you're like, okay, David, today you need to go do your compliance training. So make sure you go sit in the back corner over there where we've got a computer, then come back to work, which has the floor manager ticked off because they're like, seriously, I've got to send him back there for a half an hour and take him off the floor type of thing. And your goal is to say, hey, look, that's fine. Let's bring it together through a seamless experience.
Yes. Yeah, you're spot on with that. To go a level deeper in where there's more impact for the floor, I mean, maybe think of it like this. If I've got 10 driver's licenses right here in front of me, right? Yeah. What do we know? We know everyone passed a test, a minimally viable test to be able to drive. But who's better at parallel parking? Who can drive in the rain?
We don't know anything from the driver's license.
Exactly. If I've got a skills matrix that is living in Cornerstone that gets pushed to the shop floor, I know I've got 10 level 2 techs who all look the same. But I'm coming on shift 2 and there was a problem on shift 1. We're running behind. Who is my SWAT team? Where's the data underneath that certification that tells me who the very best people are at that procedure so that I can get my business back on track? Those are the things we're doing when we integrate work to learning.
Okay. Well, and you bringing that point up, I think this really is a good one to highlight because there was this conversation in the industry for a long time that was going, oh, we're going to see this great consolidation. Everything's going to consolidate back in together. And even with that, I'm like, to some degree, I agree with that. And I am seeing some consolidation. But like what you just talked about right there, where it's, you may have a HR or corporate system of record that holds some of these certifications you're talking about. And that is important. There's nothing wrong with that. But it's not enough to do what you just described, which is, I know that, but we just had a customer who had this just happen and we need to send out a tech who can fix it. And maybe 10 of them are certified in this thing, but that doesn't tell me the level of detail of who actually can solve this specific problem.
That's right. Yep. So that's exactly what we're trying to get to is what's right below the surface that tells you how to really optimize your business.
Okay. So with that, I thought I was going to go in a different direction and I'm going to come back to it because I am curious if you're seeing this integration with HR on some of those things, because to some degree, one of the things that as we continue moving towards the skills economy that I think companies are going to have to pick up if they aren't already is helping to tie incentives and recognition and some of this stuff to these other things that a lot of times it hasn't been. It's like, well, you're all a level 2 tech, so this is exactly what it is. Versus if I know David's actually highly specialized, he's my go-to for a lot of these things. Are you seeing more of that integration with like rewards? Because going back to this retention thing, to me, that's huge.
Yes. Yeah. And we're seeing it happen opportunistically within organizations that either are forward thinking or they've suffered the pain. And the pain I'm talking about is, again, if you think about all of the gaps in hiring right now, the pay rates have had to come up. And so you've got a very real scenario where people who are being hired today are getting paid more than those 20-year veterans for the same role.
Yeah,
And they know it
right.
because it's posted online. And so you lose these people. So organizations are going back and retrospectively like paying for the skills, right? So they can
Okay.
pay new hires for those skills, but they can pay their existing workforce, in essence, a
Okay.
bonus or a higher rate for the things they've
Okay.
accumulated over time. Yeah, we're seeing that quite a
That
bit.
Okay, that's what I was curious if you're seeing some of that, because I just continue kind of unpacking in my head how these problems exist and companies are trying to solve it, but you can't solve that without the data, because you can't just go, well, David's been here for 20 years, so we should pay him more, when it's like, well, maybe David's career's been on a one cycle repeat for 20 years and he's not actually the go-to person who has all this tribal knowledge, versus if David knows he's the one that always gets the call when something happens, he's the person who's always the go-to, and yet I know Christopher over here, who started 6 months ago, is making 30% more than me just because he happened to get hired right now. That's going to be extremely frustrating, but it's hard to solve that if you don't have the data.
Yes, and we run across so many companies where that data either wasn't retained around skills specifically, or it lived on the shop floor as an Excel that got crumpled up and thrown away every year. So
Yeah.
you don't know it. So you either have to
Right. Or the
guess.
manager doesn't last and he goes out and he takes with him all his knowledge of like who those people are. And then it's like, oh, well, now we don't have it anywhere.
That's right. So looking at our micro level skills, we see that. Just to
Okay.
finish off on that topic, we're seeing more and more push for that idea of paying for skills and aligning these systems. We're part of a consortium now with Red Thread Research, with a number
Yeah.
of those other large organizations trying to strategize around, like, for us, the real interest is how do we bring those other systems into the shop floor alongside of us? And then how do
Yeah.
we support some more of the back office side of the business? But it's a
Okay.
pretty exciting project we just kicked off.
Well, it's exciting to hear that there are steps being taken in this direction, because I hear conversations on both sides, and I often find myself kind of playing in the rough middle, because I understand where the employees are coming from. It's extremely frustrating. It's frustrating feeling like you're the one who always calls on me. I know that I could run circles around my peers, yet at the same time, I know all the recognition and the pay is going to these other folks who, would be dead if I wasn't here. Yet at the same time, I understand it's difficult for companies without the data and the solutions and the measurement to know that it's like, well, we can't just make decisions based on your feelings or the feelings of this and that. We have to make decisions based on this, because if we just go with feelings, the whole system gets wrecked, and no HR system actually operates that way. It's a very complicated situation, and a lot of that nuance is often not taken into consideration.
Very true. Very true. Yes. Yeah. The best companies that we work with, and best, just I would say, for ethical use of artificial intelligence, is maybe how I'm thinking of it here,
Yep.
are the ones where they use that data around understanding a worker's proficiency to have a meaningful conversation every month. We have one client who every month, their line supervisor sits down with every worker individually and they talk about where they're excelling, like, where are you really killing it? These are the things you do great. Maybe like now you're ready for upskilling, or like from your proficiency and your attitude, you should be a supervisor on this. Here's the areas where the data says you're struggling. First, do you agree with the data? And if you do, then what's the plan we can come up with for next month so that this number is increasing? And then we
Yeah.
can measure trending over the month so that the supervisor already has a sense of what's coming. And they can keep growing. In a year, they increase their worker productivity by 17% by being able to come up with these plans and push the learning right in the flow of work. An unexpected byproduct, they increase their retention
I was
13%.
just going to say, as you were saying this, I'm like, retention and engagement had to go through the roof based on that, based on what I know about human psychology and behavior. There's no way it couldn't have.
Exactly, right? The fact that you knew how you were being measured. An interesting, like, I mean, we all know DI and B, but we never really thought much about belonging. They did a survey where they asked, and they defined belonging And the increase in belonging of employees there less than 6 months went up by like 22%.
Oh, I'm
So
sure.
their idea of belonging was, if I, as a new employee, don't have to lean over and bug the old guy who's pretty gruff, right? Like I don't want
Yeah,
to be
he's a little
sitting
grouchy that I keep asking him questions because he's like,
yeah,
get over it already. You've been here a month.
give me everything I need to do my job effectively in this flow of work so that I'm same as everyone else. So when I go into the break room at the afternoon, they're not snickering at me as the kid who always needs help. Like, it was really, really exciting. So,
No, well, and I think that's tying to some of this. Again, it's an unexpected venture that I wasn't planning on going into, but as we got into this, it's a really important one to highlight because, again, a large part of the workforce is in this segment of the work. But two, it doesn't get the attention. And a lot of times we don't think about all these connections and how this does matter. And sometimes we're put in these positions of, well, do we choose workplace performance and optimization, or do we choose focusing on the people? And what you just highlighted in that example is, no, actually, when we get this right, it's just yes. It's not
yeah.
this or that. It's just yes. Like, well, yes, we're going to do this. We're going to invest in this. We're going to be able to identify people's skills. Some of the challenges I often see in leadership development. Well, how do we get managers to have better conversations? By giving them the information they need to have the conversations with those people so that it's not awkward. And if David thinks he's amazing, but the data's like, I mean,
that
this is what the data says. Like, how do you feel about that?
that's right, right? Like, workforce proficiency has a timeline against it. I may be as
Right.
proficient as heck, but if I have to keep picking this cup up and moving it to that space day after day, without knowing that it matters to the company, without me being recognized, without me being allowed to contribute to work and being recognized for it, I'm not staying, right? Like, that generation of worker is almost exclusively gone from the workforce. So
Yeah.
we need to be thoughtful.
Well, and yeah, and I just even think of the example you used there of, let's say, I keep using you as the example of like the crazy employee. So no offense, but like, it's one of those, like, if David, if you're amazing at moving the cup from this to this and you're super fast at it, but you keep doing it wrong and you cause this downstream effect that we have errors and omissions and there's problems that keep happening because you keep screwing it up. It doesn't matter that you think you're really fast and are, taking care of what needs to be done. It's like, well, but if you don't have that visibility and then you just get dinged and you're like, well, I didn't know, right? We don't have that visibility, and what you're offering people is greater visibility into their work.
That's exactly right. Yeah, it's not just one dimension. It's not about speed of doing anything. It's understanding outcomes, and
Yeah.
outcomes needs an integrated solution. Yeah, that
So
that
was that something that you thought, I mean, I'm just out of curiosity, was that something going into it that you thought would be a happy outcome that came from this? Because to me, as you were describing it, I'm like, this is an industrial company's retention engagement, like, dream to be able to do some of this stuff. Did you intentionally know, like, oh, this is going to have all this? Or was it one of those, we're really trying to improve workplace, connect the worker better, and then it was, hey, whoa, this is having a really positive outcome over here?
Yeah, unfortunately, it was the latter. Maybe not
It's not
unfortunately. No,
unfortunate. Who cares if you're doing it right and you're getting the outcome? Fantastic.
we did not have the foresight to see that it was going to drive retention, drive belonging more. We first wanted to make sure that there was a systematic way to capture the insights around tribal knowledge and assess where workers were and were not proficient, because that was such a huge gap. And then, to your example of what are the outcomes when David's moving fast, he's pulling those knobs too fast and something's breaking. We knew that that was completely untapped in the industrial world. So we
Yeah.
wanted to bring those insights together so that you could really understand, like, yeah, I've been around for a long time and I'm getting paid the most, but I actually am not doing your
You're
business a lot.
nothing but problems, right? You're creating chaos for everyone around you. But it's hard to have those conversations. Back to a leadership development, you've got a compounded problem. That's hard to have that conversation if you're a shop floor lead who doesn't really know the work. And you're like, I mean, I don't know. He is really going super quick on this. I don't understand the intricacies of all these downstream problems he's causing. And two, if you don't have the data to be able to go, David, I know you're really quick at this, but you are causing chaos for everyone around you. And, the reason everybody's frustrated with you is because of these things. What can we do about that to have a development conversation? I mean, this is significant.
Yep, that's exactly right. And then it's having that data on everyone else to know, is it like a systemic problem issue where you've created the wrong learnings or the wrong work procedures? And it allows my continuous improvement teams, my learning and development teams to come in and really assess that content and what's required. Or it's recognizing who I pair David with, who's really excelling at all of the steps of that work. So
yeah. Yeah. Well, and I think this is where, so first of all, I love that you're going down this path, because the timing of this is ironic, because last week I was talking with, name slipping my mind, Krishna from Apti, and we were talking very similar to these things in digital adoption, because the same kinds of problems happen in systems all the time. You see it in Salesforce with sales folks, you see it in CRMs and HR systems where people don't always understand the downstream effects. And so people keep shooting in the dark to try and fix it, but they don't realize you got to get to the person. But how do you get to the person if you don't have the data? And it's one of these chicken or egg situations. But what you're doing is bringing a level of this to the work that wasn't there before, which just improves things overall. But I think the conversation even we're having, and this is why I love having these conversations outside of the traditional spaces, you're bringing together two different points of view that help tell a better story. You understand all that industrial piece and all of that. The L&D, if people are hearing this going, so there's no room for L&D at the table, it'd be no, because we would bring that lens of, well, how does this tie to engagement and retention and belonging? And how do we tie all of our internal HR systems to this so we can incentivize based on skills and recognize and reward based on that? And recruiting, we're recruiting the right kind of skill profiles for people. I mean, this whole thing ends up becoming quickly integrated, and everybody plays a distinct role in that.
Yeah. You're exactly right. And since we've brought this skills capability to market, we've actually seen that be more of a draw because of the things you're
I'm
talking
sure.
about, engagement and retention. It doesn't matter which of our clients you go to, you're going to see job recs that have opened for 90, 120 days, incrementally large numbers of job recs open, and they never decrease because as quickly as you bring someone in, somebody
They're
else is
gone.
going out. And if you don't create that sense of belonging from day one, recognizing I've got 10 people in my onboarding class, and 4 of them worked in manufacturing before, right, and did something similar. This was parallel, but you treat them all the same. At lunchtime, you bought 10 meals and only 6 people come back into the lunchroom for their training because you scared them off already. You need to start creating that sense of belonging from day one. And
it is all so interconnected. And that to me is one of the most fascinating parts of it's why I'm in the space I'm in, is because this interconnectedness between it. But what's exciting about what you're describing is 30 years ago, what we're describing would have been either way too resource intensive or just straight up impossible for a company to do. There just would have been no way to do it with any sort of cohesiveness, because it'd be, well, this is all on paper and we're trying to do it. We need a million different folks doing it. But what we're talking about is the technology is actually enabling, making the impossible possible, and actually better than it ever has been before.
That's right. And if you think 30 years back, that I think represents that if we had this technology then, it still wouldn't have mattered, right? It would have been like flying back into the past 300 years and showing someone, I don't know, a cigarette lighter or a wheel. It wouldn't have made sense because the machine industrial really didn't feed you much of anything.
Right. Yeah, there wasn't anything for it to operate off of. Right. It'd be like, yeah, exactly. Going back in time and being like, hey, I brought you a MacBook Pro. And they'd go, I mean, what am I going to do with this? Like, I can't does it create anything I can use? They'd be like, we have 0 categories to do any of this stuff with. So that's interesting. You bring that up in terms of the change of how machines even are impacting even the work.
Yes. Yeah. And that's why, like, right now, Yeah, I don't know how to say this without it sounding self-serving, and that's not the intention. But right now, a very large portion of our business is replacing those connected worker platforms that people bought 11 years ago. Because to your point, the problem manufacturers were solving for at that time was different. It was just,
Yeah.
let's make stuff digital. Like, there was no thought of, let me give everyone a big hug and make sure they hang around. It's like,
No, nobody cared about that. I mean, really, it wasn't the priority.
yes, yeah, that's exactly.
Interesting. Well, and so even talking about this, like kind of the industrial evolution, I would say in some ways of how some of this stuff's working, not only has kind of the mindset, and this is one of the things I'm extremely thankful for the past couple of years, that companies are starting to see there's a lot more connectivity between these two things. It isn't, if you're sitting in the C-suite, you're deciding between, do we invest in our people or do we invest in innovation and technology? It's like, well, just across the
Yes.
board. But I'm curious from even just how the industrial processes and how the shop experience has changed is also fueling this. Because even again, something that came to mind as you were talking about this, machines weren't IoT before. So you often didn't have a lot of insight into how this equipment was even performing to even have the data to know some of this stuff anyway. So how have you seen that change? Because I have to imagine that's even dramatically changing the way people interact with it and what these systems are doing to help them scale up.
Yeah, 100%. Like, back, if you just went back 8 years ago, the ask would have been, can you integrate with our ERP at some point? Right? Like, that was the thought of integration. Everyone had an SAP or something. Like, now,
Yep.
every company that we walk into and start engaging with, there is a laundry list. Like, here are the 12 systems I want to integrate. And like, what are we going to be able to do over the next month, the next 2 months?
I can't tell if you froze, David, or if that's me. So if somebody's listening or watching, if you can comment in, I'm not sure if my internet geeked out or if his did.
System issue. There we go. We're back.
There we go. We're back. Okay. Well,
We're back.
anybody who was listening can alt tab.
Yeah. And
So you were
I'm
saying
actually,
before where we lost you
yeah.
was before it was, can you just connect in with it or ERP? But then it was, well, we've got these 12 systems. So not only do you have more, but then that's where you cut out.
Yeah, and the organizations are coming together. I'm going to give a shout out to Leap HR. It's an event that I went to last year. I've never seen, and it was Leap HR for manufacturing. I've never been to an event where HR, learning development, organizational development leaders were together with technologies that fit both the factory floor and drove deeper levels of engagement. It was 2.5 of the best days I've spent. There was so much thought about how to leverage technology, how to think about things like, right, some of the things that, again, the technology enables. How do we think about workers that like need a second chance, and how do we absorb them into an environment they've never worked in? How do we make it feel natural, progressive?
Right.
And they recognize that it's not just getting them on the factory floor, it's giving them an integrated set of tools that support everything that they're going to need to do. We've talked about, right? We've talked about work instructions. We've talked about having the skills and learning in there, job aids right in there, the ability to dial out to a remote expert who's sitting across the world or across the factory and bring that all together. And then from a learning perspective, have that all curated to go back into skills and learning so that the next time I bring somebody new in, they've got a better starting point than what I had before.
Well, and what's interesting about even that one, in terms of the evolution of this, I was talking to, you're seeing it everywhere more recently as companies are kind of trying to figure out the whole back to work type thing. And some of the challenges and feedback that I'll sometimes get when I talk about this is from the, industrial groups or manufacturing or frontline that say, well, certain things just can't be flexible. But first of all, one, I would challenge against that, saying, well, what's your definition of flexibility? Because flexibility doesn't just mean can you be remote or not. There are wide ranges of that, which some of the things we're talking about, even understanding how to manage shifts and what kinds of activities we might be able to do and where do we do these kinds of things, Because at the end of the day, even industrial manufacturing frontline workers want more flexibility. The data is unanimous. And so just giving a whole population of the audience the answer, that's not available to you, in my book, is unacceptable. And technology is changing the rules. I remember 2 years ago, I was talking to somebody who's doing work with the HoloLens, and I had done some work with this where we were having remote subject matter experts who were deploying to hundreds of workers from a central location where they had the flexibility they needed because they built up the skills and expertise. And they were that person that sat in the command center and did whatever. So even some of these rules of, well, we just can't do that is changing.
Yeah. You're exactly right. And I'm with you. I would have given the buzzer on that's not doable. If someone told me that, it was like, nah. Got one large CPG client that we work with who during COVID had the issue that everyone had. They expected 90 workers to show up today and only 60 made it, right? So how do I reallocate those resources? Well, first, you go back to the data, seeing under the surface of the stations that got open today, who are the most proficient. They found that they could cover those needs with less workers. Not that they're getting rid of workers, but they have to do what they've got on that day. In essence, you're making an autonomous worker because not only can you put people where they're best, but through these personalized work instructions and personalized skills, you can support them to do more than they've ever done. So that's now a strategy that this company hires with. They tout the idea that they offer flexible work schedules because they can use this technology in that way.
Which is brilliant. And I think this is one of the things that I sometimes, right, I'm with you in that I see things and people go, well, you just can't do that. And I just want to get a card table sometime with a sign on it that just says, yes, you can change my mind. Because it is one of these, technology is enabling things that just truly were impossible years ago. And that example you just described is a huge one where you go, once you understand the nuance of the workforce and how the work's done and where you can flex and where you can't, suddenly those employees where you went, sorry, we can't do anything. This is your shift and you have to do this and this. And so then they feel like, well, I can't do that, so I'll quit. Instead, you can go, what do you really need to be able to balance this work with your life? Let's have a conversation. Let's use the technology to figure out how we make that possible. Because a lot of times it's not just people going, I want to be remote. That's not what people are actually asking.
That's right. Yeah. Another great example, just this past week, one of our newer partner clients pointed out to us, they're really proud of this because they're leveraging the technology now. They have job posts, engineers for potential. And their description is, look, come be an engineer, figure out with us what you want to do. We can have dynamic learning paths along the way and figure out where you belong in our family. And they're not pigeonholing them into something. It's a great way.
I love that. Yeah. You know, and what's funny, going back, and then we'll wrap, because I'm telling you, we could sit and have this conversation for the rest of the day. But I think one of the things that's really incredible about this is that we talked in the beginning sometimes about the generational things that come with it. And I've heard like, well, this is just what the new generation wants. And I'm like, no, it's not. It's just previous generations didn't have categories for this stuff. It wasn't possible. But if you went to anybody and said, how would you feel about a more autonomous workforce, a company that's invested in getting the best out of you and bringing your best self to work, and then leveraging you in a way that just makes you feel engaged and fulfilled? It's not like suddenly Gen Z was like, that sounds great to me, but everybody else was like, oh, that sounds awful. Ugh. No, I just want to be treated like a number that I just show up and go home and nobody cares. Like this didn't change. It's just now the possibilities are there.
That's hilarious. Yeah, my family, Welsh origin, none of them ever wanted to work in the coal mines. They didn't come out singing a song at the end of the day about how happy they were for doing that. Right?
It's just you did what you had to do, and there weren't a lot of options. But I think sometimes we do forget that it's like you said. I love that they didn't come out like, you know, coughing up coal dust, going like la la la, like this is the best day of my life. But it's what you did, what you had to do. And I think what's exciting about what we talked about today is we can do better. We can do better. So why wouldn't we? It's a win-win across the board.
Yeah, that's what we're here for, to make it better. We're just trying to help in the little ways we can. Yeah, this
Well,
was a great.
this was super fun. I appreciate you making the time, David. Hopefully this has helped folks just think even differently about how can we do a better job of impacting these segments of the workforce that a lot of times we're not necessarily laser focused on in the work we do. And it's not necessarily that we have to suddenly shift our focus. It's, well, how do we incorporate them in? Because there's a lot of overlap. So I appreciate you making the time, David. This was an absolute blast.
Yeah, to everyone who took the time out there, I appreciate it. Christopher, thanks for setting this up. Hopefully I delivered at least one or two nuggets of
Oh, you
interesting.
did. You did. It
Yeah.
was a great conversation. Well, thanks everybody and have a great rest of your week.